A heated confrontation erupts in first class when Margaret Sterling demands an elderly black passenger move from his seat, convinced he doesn't belong there. The corporate executive uses her platinum status as a weapon, publicly humiliating the quiet man who offers no resistance. As phones capture every moment and the man quietly retreats to coach, Margaret settles smugly into what she believes is rightfully hers. But when the pilot's voice crackles over the intercom 9 minutes later, her moment of perceived victory becomes the beginning of her downfall. The airplane cabin hummed with tension thick as storm clouds. Passengers craned their necks toward first class where voices rose above the engine's drone. Phone cameras lifted like weapons, recording everything. Margaret Sterling stood in the aisle, her designer suit sharp as her voice. Platinum luggage tags caught the overhead light. Her manicured finger pointed at the elderly black man seated quietly in 1A. "I don't care what your ticket says." Her words cut through the cabin noise. "I have platinum status. I fly this route monthly." The old man looked up from his worn leather briefcase. His eyes held something deeper than surprise, something that had seen worse storms than this. "There's obviously been some mistake," Margaret continued. Her phone buzzed against her palm. Board meeting texts, career-defining presentation, everything riding on today. Colonel James Washington closed his briefcase with careful hands, the kind of hands that had gripped different controls in different skies decades ago. He stood slowly, joints protesting 75 years of living. "No trouble, ma'am. I'll find another seat." His voice carried the weight of mountains, quiet, unshakable. Margaret's chest tightened with vindication. See? He knew he didn't belong here. The natural order restored itself when people remembered their place. Other first-class passengers shifted in their leather seats. A businessman in 1B held his phone steady, recording. His thumb hovered over the share button, viral gold unfolding before his eyes. But something in the old man's bearing made him hesitate. Sarah Mitchell, the young flight attendant, watched from the galley, 23 years old and 6 months on the job. Something familiar tugged at her memory. The way the old man carried himself. Military straight despite his age. She'd seen that posture before, in photos, in company newsletters about honoring veterans. Her stomach knotted. Colonel Washington gathered his things without haste. No anger flickered across his weathered face. He'd learned long ago that dignity lived in how you carried yourself when the world tried to strip it away. The briefcase handle was smooth from decades of grip. Government seals faded but still visible on the leather. He lifted it like it contained something precious, which it did. Margaret watched him stand. Victory tasted like champagne bubbles on her tongue. She'd worked too hard to let anyone take what was hers, clawed her way up from nothing, earned her place through blood and sleepless nights. The old man stepped into the aisle. Passengers parted like water around stone. He nodded politely to each face, meeting their eyes without shame. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked the passenger manifest on her tablet. The name glowed on the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. Colonel Washington walked past Margaret without a glance. His footsteps measured and steady. A soldier's march softened by time but never broken. Margaret slipped into seat 1A while the leather still held his warmth. The cushions molded to her frame like they'd been waiting. She smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the window. Perfect. Behind her, murmurs rippled through the cabin. Phones still recording. But the narrative was shifting. Something about the old man's grace in defeat made Margaret's victory feel hollow. The businessman in 1B studied his phone screen. The footage showed Margaret's anger, her pointing finger, her assumption of authority. But it also showed the old man's quiet dignity, the way he'd accepted humiliation without fighting back. Something wasn't right about this picture. Colonel Washington made his way to coach, row 23, seat C, next to a young boy traveling alone. Tommy, according to his luggage tag, 10 years old and white-knuckling the armrests. The boy looked up as the colonel settled beside him. Fear and curiosity warred in his young eyes. "Are you scared too?" Tommy whispered. Colonel Washington smiled for the first time since boarding, a real smile that reached his eyes and touched something deep in his chest where metals used to rest. "Son, I've flown in much rougher skies than this." His voice carried the weight of truth, of missions over hostile territory, of coming home when others didn't, of earning the right to sit anywhere through blood and courage. Sarah approached Captain Reynolds at the cockpit door. Her tablet shook in her hands. The passenger manifest glowed like an accusation. She whispered urgently in his ear. Captain Reynolds' eyes widened, then narrowed. His jaw set like granite as he looked toward first class, then back toward coach. Margaret Sterling sat in seat 1A, checking her presentation notes, oblivious to the storm gathering around her. The phone calls she'd make from this seat, the promotion she'd secure, the life she'd built on the assumption that she deserved the best simply because she could take it. The engines hummed, the cabin settled into flight rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the enclosed space 30,000 feet above the earth. Truth had boarded this plane in an unexpected form, and truth, like dignity, had a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep you tried to bury it. Captain Reynolds made a decision that would change everything. The plane climbed through thin air like a prayer-seeking heaven. In coach, Colonel Washington adjusted his seatbelt with the precision of a man who'd strapped himself into far more dangerous machines. Tommy pressed his nose against the window, watching clouds drift past like cotton balls scattered by an invisible hand. His small fingers drummed against the plastic shade. "Is it always this bumpy?" The boy's voice carried the tremor of first flights and absent parents. Colonel Washington studied the child's profile. Something in Tommy's nervous energy reminded him of young pilots he'd once known, boys who became men too quickly in wartime skies. "Turbulence is just air finding its way." His words fell soft as rain on parched ground. "Plane knows how to handle it." Tommy turned from the window. His eyes caught the small pin on the colonel's jacket lapel. Wings spread wide over a star, tarnished but proud. "Were you a pilot?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Colonel Washington's fingers found the pin without looking. Muscle memory from decades of checking, straightening, remembering. Long time ago. The boy waited for more. Children possessed endless patience for stories about flying. But the colonel's eyes held distances that couldn't be crossed with words alone. Above them, Margaret Sterling's phone vibrated against first-class leather. Her assistant's voice crackled through the speaker like static electricity. "The Harrison presentation needs to be flawless. The board is already questioning your judgment after the Henderson debacle." Margaret's knuckles whitened around the device. 6 months of political maneuvering hung on the next 4 hours. She'd clawed her way from a trailer park in Alabama to the 37th floor of corporate America. Each rung of the ladder slick with the blood of people she'd stepped on. "I've worked too hard to let anything derail this promotion." Her voice carried the edge of desperation disguised as determination. The businessman in 1B glanced over. He'd caught fragments of her conversation, the fear beneath her aggression. People who truly belonged somewhere never had to announce it so loudly. His phone still held the footage from earlier. Margaret's finger pointed like an accusation. The old man's quiet dignity. Something about the contrast bothered him like a splinter under the skin. In the galley, Sarah clutched her tablet with white knuckles. The passenger manifest glowed like a confession waiting to be heard. She'd found the company newsletter from last week. Military Appreciation Month. Featured story about Tuskegee Airmen. The photograph stared back at her. Younger face, but same eyes. Same bearing that carried history like invisible wings. Colonel James Washington, Congressional Medal of Honor, 75 years of service. The man Margaret Sterling had dismissed like dust on expensive shoes. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots that would shame a sailor. She approached Captain Reynolds at the cockpit threshold. Her tablet shook like autumn leaves in her grip. "Captain." Her whisper barely rose above the engine's hum. "I need to show you something." Reynolds took the tablet. His dark eyes scanned the screen. The newsletter photo. The passenger manifest. The impossible connection between heroism and humiliation. His jaw muscles jumped like live wires under his skin. Behind them, the first-class cabin hummed with privilege and assumption. Margaret Sterling spread presentation materials across her tray table like battle plans, charts and graphs that measured success in dollars rather than dignity. She'd learned early that the world respected only what it could quantify: stock prices, market share, the kind of numbers that turned trailer park girls into boardroom queens. But some mathematics couldn't be calculated on spreadsheets. Captain Reynolds looked toward Coach through the narrow aisle, past the fabric partition that separated classes like an arbitrary border between worth and worthlessness. Somewhere back there sat a man who'd earned the right to any seat on any plane through courage that couldn't be bought. And he'd been moved to the back by a woman who'd never earned anything except the ability to demand what didn't belong to her. Tommy shifted in his seat beside the colonel. The boy's nervousness had settled into something like comfort. Adults rarely listened to children with such complete attention. My dad says real heroes don't brag about being heroes. Colonel Washington's smile carried the weight of truth recognized by innocence. Children saw clearly what adults chose to ignore. Your father sounds like a wise man. The plane shuddered through another pocket of turbulence. Colonel Washington's hands remained steady on his briefcase. Inside, commendations and certificates lay pressed between leather-like flowers preserved from a garden long since withered. He'd carried those documents to the Pentagon yesterday, stood before generals and politicians who spoke of honor while practicing expedience, shook hands that had never been calloused by honest work or bloodied by honest sacrifice. The ceremony had felt hollow as wind through empty barrels, but this boy's genuine curiosity meant more than a dozen formal recognitions. Sarah returned to Captain Reynolds' side. Her tablet now displayed the seating chart. Seat 1A marked clearly with the colonel's name, a complimentary upgrade for distinguished military guests. The woman in his seat had simply assumed the better placement belonged to her. Reynolds studied the evidence like a judge weighing scales of justice. His own grandfather had flown with the Tuskegee Airmen, had come home from war to face the same prejudice he'd risked his life to defeat. Some battles never truly ended. They just found new battlefields. The captain's finger traced the colonel's name on the manifest. A decision crystallized in his mind like ice forming on wings at altitude, clear and sharp and unbreakable. He would not let this stand. The intercom system waited like a loaded weapon. One announcement could change everything, expose truth to light, force reckoning where comfortable lies had taken root. Margaret Sterling closed her eyes in first class. The presentation would succeed. The promotion would come. She'd paid the price in dignity, discarded like empty bottles along the roadside. But some debts couldn't be settled with career advancement. Captain Reynolds reached for the microphone. The intercom crackled to life like lightning-splitting summer air. Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the cabin's murmur with the precision of a blade-finding bone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. Conversations died mid-sentence, phones lowered from ears. Even the flight attendants paused their service rituals to listen. Margaret Sterling's pen froze above her presentation notes. Something in the captain's tone carried weight beyond routine announcements. Her chest tightened like a fist closing around her ribs. Before we begin our descent, I need to address something that happened during boarding. The words fell into silence, thick as morning fog. Passengers shifted in their seats. Eyes turned toward first class, where assumptions had taken root like weeds in fertile ground. Margaret's phone slipped from her fingers. The plastic clattered against her tray table like dice thrown by fate. Her mouth went dry as desert sand. In coach, Colonel Washington felt the attention gathering around him like storm clouds building on the horizon. Tommy looked up from his coloring book, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded revelation. The gentleman who was asked to move from first class is Colonel James Washington. The name hung in recycled air like incense in a cathedral, sacred and weighted with meaning most passengers couldn't yet grasp. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Her carefully constructed reality cracked like ice under spring sunshine. The old man hadn't been some random passenger trying to steal her seat. He'd been someone. Tuskegee Airmen. Gasps rippled through the cabin like wind through wheat fields. Phones lifted again, but not to make calls. to record history unfolding at 30,000 feet. The businessman in 1B felt his stomach drop into freefall. His finger hovered over the delete button on his phone. The footage suddenly carried different weight, context that transformed victim into villain. Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. Sarah closed her eyes in the galley. Relief and shame warred in her chest like opposing armies. She'd recognized the truth, but failed to act. Knowledge without courage was just another form of cowardice. Margaret gripped her armrests like they could anchor her to a world that no longer made sense. Medal of Honor. The highest recognition her country could bestow, and she'd treated him like he didn't deserve to breathe the same air. He just returned from the Pentagon, where he was honored for 75 years of service to our country. The silence that followed was deafening, more profound than the absence of sound. It was the quiet of revelation settling into bones like winter cold. Colonel Washington remained still in seat 23C. His weathered hands folded over his briefcase like he was holding fragments of a life lived in service to ideals larger than himself. Tommy stared at the man beside him with new eyes, the kind of wonder children reserved for superheroes and astronauts. Real heroes, it turned out, looked like grandfathers who told gentle stories about turbulence. Captain Reynolds wasn't finished. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd reached the breaking point of tolerance for injustice. Colonel Washington's ticket shows seat 1A, a complimentary upgrade for distinguished military guests. The revelation hit the cabin like a physical blow. Margaret's assumption that the better seat automatically belonged to her crumbled into dust in memory. There had been no mistake, only prejudice disguised as privilege. The boarding pass in her purse felt like evidence at a crime scene. 1B clearly printed on airline paper. She'd taken what wasn't hers and convinced herself she was restoring natural order. But nature had its own justice. Phones turned toward first class like searchlights seeking truth in shadows. Margaret Sterling, corporate executive, platinum member, successful climber of ladders built on other people's backs, became the villain in her own story. The businessman beside her shifted away like she carried contagion. His own privilege suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone who mistook entitlement for earned position. In coach, passengers craned their necks to see the man whose quiet dignity had just been revealed as heroism. Colonel Washington remained motionless as carved stone, uncomfortable with attention he'd never sought. He'd spent his life earning respect through actions, not words, through service that asked for nothing except the chance to prove worth through deed rather than declaration. Margaret's presentation materials scattered as her hands shook. Charts measuring quarterly growth seemed meaningless against metrics of character she'd never learned to calculate. Her phone buzzed with messages about the board meeting. The promotion that had seemed within grasp now felt distant as stars in daylight sky. Tommy reached over and touched Colonel Washington's sleeve. The boy's small gesture carried more genuine respect than all the ceremonial handshakes at yesterday's Pentagon gathering. "Are you really a hero?" Colonel Washington looked into eyes unclouded by prejudice or assumption. Children asked the questions adults were too proud to voice. "I just did what needed doing, son." His answer carried the humility of greatness that never advertised itself. True heroism lived in quiet moments between fanfare, in choosing right over easy when nobody was watching. The intercom fell silent. Captain Reynolds had delivered truth like a surgeon removing cancer. Clean cuts that hurt, but healed. Margaret sat alone in seat 1A, surrounded by evidence of her mistake. The leather still held the colonel's warmth when she'd stolen it. Now it felt cold as judgment against her skin. Around her, the cabin buzzed with whispered conversations. Phones captured her isolation. Social media posts wrote themselves in real time. The woman who'd demanded her rightful place had discovered that some positions couldn't be claimed, only earned through service that measured worth in sacrifice rather than stock options. Colonel Washington closed his eyes and felt the plane's steady progress through endless sky. He'd flown this route before in different aircraft, through hostile air where courage was the only currency that mattered. The turbulence today felt gentle by comparison. Truth had a way of finding altitude no matter how thick the clouds of deception grew. Captain Reynolds set the autopilot with hands that had learned precision through decades of flight. The cockpit door opened with a soft click that echoed through the cabin like a judge's gavel. He stepped into the aisle with the bearing of a man carrying purpose heavier than gravity. His uniform creases sharp as folded steel. Every passenger felt his presence like electricity before thunder. The flight attendants recognized the moment's weight. Sarah moved first, her young face set with determination born from shame. She fell into step behind the captain like a soldier following orders she should have given herself. One by one, the crew joined the procession. Senior attendants who'd served 20 years. Junior staff still learning the difference between service and servitude. All walking toward the back of the plane where Truth waited in seat 23C. Margaret Sterling watched the parade pass her stolen throne, her knuckles white against first-class leather. The presentation materials scattered across her tray table like broken promises. Her phone buzzed with board meeting reminders. Stock prices, quarterly projections. Numbers that had once seemed important as heartbeats now felt hollow as wind through empty houses. In coach, Colonel Washington sensed the approaching ceremony before he saw it. Attention focused on him like sunlight through a magnifying glass. He'd spent 75 years avoiding such moments. Heroes, in his experience, did their jobs and went home. Captain Reynolds reached row 23 and came to attention, his salute sharp as winter air, military precision honoring military sacrifice. Colonel Washington. The name carried weight that transcended rank, recognition that couldn't be bought or borrowed or stolen from better men. Colonel Washington looked up from his briefcase. His eyes held the weariness of someone who'd seen too much history unfold in fire and blood and bitter victory. He stood slowly, joints protesting time's passage, but spirit unbroken by decades of carrying burdens others couldn't imagine. The salute he returned was perfect. Muscle memory from 1,000 formations, a gesture that connected him to every soldier who'd ever stood between freedom and its enemies. Around them, passengers rose like wheat before wind. The businessman from 1B, families with children, elderly couples who remembered when heroes came home to parades instead of protests. Tommy remained seated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of adult emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. But he understood enough. The quiet man who'd comforted his fears was someone important, someone worthy of respect he'd never thought to demand. The applause began as a whisper, scattered clapping that grew into thunder. Not the polite appreciation of airline passengers, but something deeper. Recognition of sacrifice that couldn't be repaid. Colonel Washington nodded once, a slight bow of acknowledgement that carried more grace than Margaret Sterling had shown in her entire career. He didn't grandstand or speechify, didn't use the moment to lecture about respect or dignity or the price of freedom. True power, he'd learned, lived in restraint. Margaret remained frozen in seat 1A while the ovation continued around her. Isolation, complete as Arctic wind. The seat that had seemed like victory now felt like a prison built from her own assumptions. Her phone captured none of this. The recording apps and social media posts belonged to other passengers now. People who understood that some stories were bigger than personal ambition. Captain Reynolds maintained his salute until the colonel's hand dropped. Military courtesy observed between men who understood duty's true weight. The crew dispersed back to their stations. The passengers settled into their seats. But something fundamental had shifted in the pressurized air. Tommy tugged at Colonel Washington's sleeve as the old man lowered himself back into 23C. My grandpa always said real heroes don't need to tell people they're heroes. The boy's words carried wisdom that came from generations of men who'd served without expecting medals, who'd done what needed doing because it needed doing. Colonel Washington smiled, a real expression that reached his eyes and touched something deep in his chest where pride lived quietly. Your grandfather sounds like he knew something about heroes. The plane continued its descent toward earth and judgment. Margaret Sterling gathered her scattered papers with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. She'd built her success on the assumption that worth was something you could claim rather than earn. That seats at tables belonged to whoever grabbed them first, but some positions couldn't be stolen. Passengers began filing toward the exits as the plane taxied to the gate. Margaret remained seated, unable to face the walk past the man whose place she'd taken. The businessman from 1B deleted the recording from his phone. Some stories weren't meant for viral fame. Some truths were too important for social media consumption. Colonel Washington stood and retrieved his briefcase, the leather handle worn smooth by decades of grip. Inside, commendations and certificates lay pressed between leather like pressed flowers from a garden of service. Tommy hugged him goodbye with the fierce affection children reserved for adults who treated them like people rather than inconveniences. "Will I see you again?" "Maybe, son. Heroes have a way of turning up when you need them most." The colonel walked toward the exit with measured steps. A lifetime of military precision softened by age but never broken by circumstance. Margaret finally found courage to stand, her legs unsteady as a newborn colt. She approached him near the gate, words failing like engines at altitude. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Her apology fell into silence, thick as prayer. Colonel Washington looked at her with eyes that had seen worse storms than wounded pride. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life proving I belong in places people said I didn't. The difference is I earned my place through service, not by pushing others down." He walked past her toward the jetway where a young gate agent waited to help with his bag. Margaret stood alone in the empty plane. The boarding pass lay on the floor where it had fallen from his pocket, clear printing that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Seat 1A, Pentagon VIP guest. Complimentary upgrade for distinguished service. She picked up the paper with shaking fingers. Evidence of her mistake. Proof that assumptions could destroy more than careers. The gate agent looked up as Colonel Washington approached. Young face bright with respect that didn't need explanation. "Thank you for your service, sir." Colonel Washington paused at the threshold between plane and terminal, between the small sky where petty conflicts played out and the larger world where real battles waited. Dignity isn't about the seat you're given, son. It's about how you carry yourself when someone tries to take it away. The words carried the weight of 75 years spent proving worth through action rather than declaration, of a life lived in service to ideals larger than personal comfort. Margaret Sterling stood alone in the empty aircraft, holding evidence of her failure. The boarding pass crumpled in her fist, like hopes built on other people's diminishment. Outside, Colonel Washington walked through the terminal with the steady gait of a man who'd never needed to prove he belonged anywhere, his briefcase containing a lifetime of earned honors, his heart carrying the quiet satisfaction of dignity maintained under pressure. The hero had been moved to the back of the plane. But heroes, like truth, had a way of rising to where they belonged. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.